So I started thinking about benefits of playing a 1916 style outside of just which hands were theoretically profitable pre-flop. This, the benefit of not quite fitting in, is perhaps the weakest of these arguments, but I think it's interesting enough on a philosophical level to mention. And the argument hinges on this fact. Humans are classifying creatures. I know that Richard Dawkins refers to this as the problem of the discontinuous mind, and from a cognitive point of view it has to do with the brain trying to make sense of the world around it without having to overextend. There's so much variation in the world that trying to keep track of every minute detail is impossible, and instead we create categories and deal with things according to the nearest match we can find. I was originally going to make an analogy with how we think about short people and tall people and how some inevitably fall right on the edge between our classifications, but I'm going to jump right ahead to the poker scenario because I don't think the concept needs the help of an analogy. So, if we let the staples represent pre-flop raise percentage, we might put classifications like this in there. And a good poker player learns how to deal with a nit, how to handle a tag, how to stack off a lag, and how to avoid folding when he plays a maniac. But how finely does he divide his categories? I think it's unlikely that anyone actually plays differently versus a 16-13 compared to a 17-14 or even an 18-15. At least I usually don't. When it comes to pre-flop ranges, I have maybe 6 different categories of opponents, and once I decide to place my current opponent into one of those categories, I play the hand accordingly. But that means that I'm bound to make a little bit of a mistake when I have to deal with someone who falls right in between two of my archetypes. If I treat this player as a nit, I'm folding too much, and if I treat him as a standard tag, I'm calling too much. And the point is simple. In poker, there's value in your opponents being wrong about your range and or how to adjust to you. Therefore, there's value in not being smack in the middle of typical classifications. Perhaps this doesn't strike you as an eye-opening experience, and you could maybe argue that it's almost silly of me to bring this up. Like I said, it's not a very strong argument for adjusting your pre-flop style, but I think it's an interesting idea in itself, and I especially think that it has implications for how finely or coarsely we adjust to opponents in general, not the least post-flop. So, if my style, being 1916, is between most of the other regulars, most of the other tags at 22-19, so I'm slightly tighter than they are and slightly looser than a nit, then this argument is basically that there is some value in that. It's not a really strong argument, but I wanted to mention it. So let's move on. Multitabling is a problem of resource allocation, and I've already touched on the brain being restricted in how much it can deal with. So it's trivially true that when you start adding more tables to your multitabling sessions, you're going to have to spend more mental capacity overall, and you're going to have less time per decision that you make. And I've already said this, but someone who plays 23-20 plays 20% more hands than a 19-16, and that means more time spent on each table. To add 20% at the bottom of my range. Because that's what I'm doing when I'm opening up my pre-flop range. I'm adding hands to it that are less profitable than the ones I already play, or else I'm wrong about which hands are the most profitable and should work on that first and foremost. But this is what I want you to consider when you add new hands to your pre-flop range, when you decide to lag it up a little. If you insist on playing as many tables as you can, then time spent on decisions is your most precious resource. Use it where it's best spent. In theory, of course, I should be playing every hand that is plus EV and playing an infinite amount of tables from hours on ends. But I'm not a computer. Nor for that matter am I this guy. Alright, that was my second argument for tightening up. I've now come to the best reason for it, and it's the one that's the toughest to admit to myself. I may not be good enough. This is not easy for any poker player to admit, and I'm no exception. If there's a poker player who's better than he thinks he is, I'd be very surprised. We all overestimate our abilities, and hopefully we're smart enough to consciously act on it and make our shortcomings as cheap as possible. Now I want to return to the second layer of misunderstanding of this statement. Just because they win more with a wider range than I play does not mean that I would win more with a wider range. Like I said before, the more obvious misunderstanding lies in thinking that if I can get my stats similar to those of a big winning player, I'll be winning more myself. The less subtle, and I'm tempted to say harder to admit, reason for this, for why this isn't true, is what I'm going to be talking about next. There are 169 different starting hands, and only one of them is without exception correct to play pre-flop. And no, you almost probably never fold pocket kings pre-flop with 100 blind stacks, but only one hand has dibs on being the one hand in your range that is definitely playable, and that's pocket aces. Everything else depends. Now what I'm going to do next is a huge oversimplification, and it is really just done to drive home a point. These are my starting hands from 30,000 hands of 1-2 no limit played in June, sorted by profitability. I had to remove pocket aces from this graph because it was such a big spike that it made the rest of the values hard to see around the x-axis. Now, scrolling through Holder Manager, I find the hand closest to being break-even. Jack 4 suited. Not that the hand itself matters. No, the point I want to make is this. A better player than myself won't just win more on the hands that I show as being profitable, he will probably turn a profit from a wider range of hands. Let's say, for instance, that Cottonseed had constructed a similar graph for the very same games I play in. His break-even point would lie farther to the right. Sorry about that. And then you have someone whose profitable pre-flop range is even more narrow than my own, and that was the slide we saw there. And that's the point. Just because someone else can profitably play a wider range than I do doesn't make it follow that I can profitably widen my own range. This is worth remembering whenever you're watching a training video of a high-stakes player playing small-stakes games. I used Cottonseed as an example because I remember, and it must have been quite a while back, watching him defending his big blind versus a button steal by flatting in some video. By flatting, and I think the hand was Queen 10 offsuit. And when I saw that, I made the mistake of thinking that Queen 10 offsuit was a profitable hand to defend by flatting in the big blind versus opponents like the one he was playing at the time. So I started doing that for a while afterwards. But of course that's wrong of me to think. Cotton is a better player than I am post-flop, and the fact that he has a positive expectation with a certain hand doesn't mean that I do, even when we're playing the same games. So the take-home lesson of all of this is this. Don't be shy about folding hands that aren't winners for you, even if they should be. And especially consider what I said about these marginal hands that you may end up folding. They're the bottom part of your range. Look at that graph again. The bulk of your profit is not going to come from hands just to the left of your break-even point. You're not giving up much by folding them, and at worst you're losing money by playing them.